What I wanted to do in terms of talking about all means all, and it doesn't mean all children either. It means all people, if you want, in literally almost every sphere of life. So it's across the lifespan, across all dimensions of life, and it's across all individuals with disabilities. But I've picked this little piece of work, and I'm going back in a sense 30 years ago, just as a way of illustrating that, you know, these are decades of work that we've been struggling with, and just that what I was engaged with at that time was a number of families. I've been doing inclusive education and lots of other things around kids in early childhood settings, which went relatively well. But then the transition to grade 1 seemed to be like a transition to another world, actually, in terms of the resistance that we found. And so there were families who were trying to create change. They wanted their kids out of segregated schools. They wanted them in regular schools. When they were in regular schools, they wanted them out of special ed classes with some time with their peers, and so forth. And partly it's because the way they saw the world was that the outcomes of special education or education at that time was in fact day programs and sheltered workshops, right? And so people end up with still really, you know, phenomenal rates of unemployment, of poverty, of impoverished lives, of lack of friends in their lives, lack of natural supports, and often dependent on paid supports, which change at a phenomenal and great rate depending on what funding is available. And so this wasn't in fact in their interest in trying to create a good life for their sons and daughters. This was not the outcomes that they were in fact hoping for. And so we wanted to try to figure out then what would be a way of trying to alter things dramatically. So incremental change was taking a phenomenal long time, particularly with schools. And you will hear me be critical at times of schooling and the culture of schooling. So in a way, in my own defense, I am married to a school superintendent. So it makes for interesting dinner conversations, actually, in terms of our different roles. And I have a daughter-in-law who's a teacher. So I also understand something from the other side, so to speak, if we consider it as sides at times. And that we wanted, in effect, to see what would happen if we challenged ourselves. And one of the propositions we hold is that we are, in fact, and therefore people with disabilities, limited by our imaginations. So we'd like to think our imaginations are unlimited, that they're expansive, that they know no limits, but that, in fact, has not been our reality. And it's both true for families and those who are advocates that we unconsciously, in fact, limit the possibilities for people with different disabilities. And so what we decided to do was that these were parents I was working with who were on the cusp of finishing high school and wanted to see something different. So one of the processes we use is something called Normative Pathways. And I will, over the 2 days, explain that to a greater degree, but most of you, I don't know all your individual stories, of course, most of you would actually be on a normative pathway and would have been since you were born or beforehand. That is, your parents were already thinking of you in terms of what your life would look like and how you would follow that pathway over time, and even though you've all been on normative pathways, you're all unique, individual, and many of you would have had unexpected life outcomes. So how many of you, for example, are working in the field in which you actually thought you would be doing when you were in high school? A few, but not too many, right? So what we want is a life of unexpected possibilities, as is true for us, those of us without disabilities. So we wanted to challenge these notions, and what we decided to do was to see what was a normative pathway, at least for some individuals who were leaving high school with significant intellectual disabilities, and that is, people without disabilities would often go on, not all, to post-secondary education or training. They need time to mature, to grow, to develop memories. I think Leslie said it earlier, right? To have the things you look back on your college and university, right? The things you haven't yet shared with your parents or your spouses, for example. Those are the memories that you hold. There's high expectations for learning in post-secondary education, at least we'd like to think so. You have valued identities and roles, at least in our culture. You meet an amazing number of people to have multiple opportunities for relationships. There's lots of choices. I mean, look at the difference between what a college or university has to offer when you're looking at their calendar, for example, of courses, programs of studies, faculties, etc., and then compare that to the options typically laid out in front of somebody with an intellectual disability. There is, in fact, no comparison, relatively speaking. We all want to be engaged in typically lifelong learning. So the question was, if we were going to include people in places that we hadn't yet seen them included, who should we begin with? So our idea was to try to include people in university, in very elite academic institutions which prided themselves on the fact that you had to compete to get in, only so many of you could get in, there were limited spaces, and if you're lucky to get in, you in fact might end up with a better life than might be true otherwise. So these were places, if you want, where people were not thinking at that time. Today in Alberta alone, we have 20 of our 26 publicly funded post-secondary institutions have inclusive post-secondary education for people with significant intellectual disabilities, more proportionately than anywhere else in the world. So if we can do it in Alberta, it's probably possible in Nebraska, because you don't get frozen here the way we do, right, typically. So who should we start with? The typical ideology or thought at the time was, well, you start with those most likely to be successful, because you want to establish the validity of your effort, and then after you've done that, because you're at risk. In fact, to be honest, even though I had the relationships to allow this to begin with universities, most people thought we were out of our minds. This is never going to work. And so you'd want to start with those you might have the best chance of success at. And then, of course, those with more significant, multiple, the most severe disabilities, they would have an opportunity to then be included afterwards. I'd never seen that happen yet. They always waited. They're always on the margins, right? So we decided that we would start by including those, not exclusively, but as part of the numbers of students we began with, young people we began with, to include those, and here's where we get into that dilemma of what does it mean to have the most severe disability, right? And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit just to try to illustrate it. And we also thought if we included those individuals we thought of as most challenging, okay, those who would be difficult to understand what life could look like in university, we would learn far more about facilitated inclusion than we would ever learn, in fact, by including those individuals who challenged us less. And so that's how we began. And I won't have time to really do this much today, actually, but in a sense, inclusive post-secondary education, where there are, in fact, no laws requiring this in Canada, you have to do it all through relationships, if you want, and through convincing people of the merits of this particular approach, really follows very comparable to inclusive education from K to 12 as it was just described. So you have to understand everybody is an individual. There's no congregation, no segregation, no grouping. Just like when you went to university and college, for those of you that did, you chose typically individually where you might go. You might have had a friend going to the same university and college and gone with them, but you typically pursued your own course of studies. So we're in there exactly the same faculties, programs, courses as anyone else. And in that context, whatever that curriculum is, it has to be modified and adapted along with the instruction to accommodate a student with intellectual disabilities. And in effect, these are universities and colleges where there would be limited seats in a lab. There are only so many microscopes to go around. And that means, in terms of equity, some seats have to be set aside for students who can't ordinarily compete. Otherwise, they never have the opportunity to be included in university or college. What's been most striking, one of the things I should say that's been most striking about this is the lack of resistance in post-secondary education for us to have students accommodated. It's as if, again, we're stepping into another world. In fact, where we live, if you want, just a little bit north of you now, inclusive schooling is probably the most difficult place we've tried to achieve inclusion. We've done better in inclusive employment, better inclusive recreation and leisure and cultural activities, et cetera, and so on, but schools remain, in fact, one of the most challenging environments we have in our context. These are I just interspersed them with shots of people because I thought they'd be a lot more interesting than just reading this. This is Joanne. I have no idea where the dog is, but Joanne initially grew up on a farm till about the age of 6, a large family. This would have been in the 50s or so, and she couldn't, the family couldn't accommodate her, and so she lived in multiple institutions. She went in a sense, being able to talk and to walk, but when I met her, She was in her early 30s. She was in an institution in our community where she actually had been in bed for 3 years. She basically would be washed once, I think twice a week. She had a radio on in her room that would have music playing, and her family would visit her there. And so she's had no education throughout the entirety of her life. And at this point in time, she has no ordinary means of communication. In fact, she has very significant physical disabilities. And we thought, gee, Joanne would be a good candidate to be included in university. We had to go and find people. There were not people saying and thinking, gee, why isn't she in university, for example. So we had to go and find people to do that. This is just Joanne again. Now, Joanne, this is a horse. I don't know if you can see it licking her. You can't see it very well. I live in a cowboy province, right? We have the Stampede in Calgary. Just a little tourism boost for Alberta, right? And so it's pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of province, etc. And so we have equestrian centers in our communities, actually. So riding, if you want, and roping and all those other things that go along being a cowboy, which I am not, which I think is fairly obvious, is ordinary. So with Joanne, we had to figure out then what would life look like for her. 10 minutes, okay. And basically, because she had literally no life to speak of, we're grasping at straws, if you want, at threads, trying to weave it back together again. And Joanne had grown up on a family. What we knew, at least, is that she enjoyed being outside with her mom. She enjoyed the farm, etc. There was an equestrian center associated with the university. It's amazing what universities will consider post-secondary education, like all kinds of sports activities, for example. Doesn't ring as humor here. It does to me, actually, because I'm not particularly athletic. And so we involved Joanne in the riding program, in the equestrian program. Probably riding is not the academic term they would use, and so on. And she, in a sense, had this affinity for horses, as did these other young people. And they could share that. They could see that. She couldn't tell them that, right? She couldn't do much for herself. But, in fact, when she was around them, she would light up. She'd pick up her head, for example. In order to be able to brush down the horses, there were staff here associated with her and supporting her, but we made sure our staff never know what to do, actually. And the reason is, then they need the people who know what to do, actually, to assist Joanne. And in some ways, you almost have to be engaged physically with Joanne to then be able to sit down and have coffee and have a conversation about what your days looked like. Because if you haven't had that engagement, if you haven't had that relationship, it's hard, in fact, just to have a conversation with her. So when they would, I don't know the technical term, it's not walk around the ring, there's something for it, with the horses and so on. Joanne loved to hold on to straps. She really liked purses, by the way, which is really an unusual characteristic for a young woman, I thought. And so she would hold on to the reins of the horse quite tightly, right? Someone would have to push her chair. And she'd walk with everybody else, and they'd be laughing and talking, and the horse would nuzzle her to get at the apple that's on the tray on her chair. Somebody would help feed the horse, and the horse would tickle her. Joanne had an infectious laugh, and you'd watch them walking around, and you'd literally see her disability, all those years, decades, drop away. And as a result, she's had a fairly enriched, I won't go back in, fairly enriched life. She's had a pretty inclusive life. She lives in her own home. She's involved in women's activities. She teaches children to read. I was going to use this later, now I've stopped myself up. How would she teach children to read? Some of you who are teachers, what do young kids need when they're trying to read? Practice. Somebody to listen, and listen non-judgmentally, right? Somebody that's really interested in what they have to say, enjoys hearing them, and so on, right? Which, of course, I had to do with my grandchildren and learn not to say, that's not the right way to say that. Because that doesn't endear yourself to your grandchildren, apparently, or to their parents, I found out. So Joanne, right, would welcome children into her lap, for example. She used to babysit, in fact, for her sisters. And she introduced one of her sisters to one of her staff, and the result of which is Joanne has also been a matchmaker. And now she has nieces and nephews as a consequence of that. But there are other people that are difficult to include. I'm going to talk more about Todd later on this morning. And so this was some of his description. I do a lot of work with children in the child welfare system who have disabilities. Now, this is somebody who'd be welcome into a classroom when he's described this way, actually. Okay? And so we won't go through this, just some more examples of it. It doesn't matter. This is just a partial list because we've been doing this for a long time now across a lot of kids, a lot of young people, I should say, and in fact in different parts of the world. And people have just as an amazing array of interests, if you want, as someone without a disability. There's no difference. Some want to go part-time and work part-time. Some want to go full-time. Some want to change the program and study if they're in. Some want to leave for a while and come back later. And so the experience then is very much typical and the same as it is for people without disabilities. Now the remote is doing something. This was David. I had to put that up there. It's a Professor Pie throwing fundraising because otherwise you don't know what's going on in the top corner there because David's about to slam this pie with the help of people into this professor's face. I don't know if you do that here. I don't know why anyone would do this actually, but that's what they're doing. But David has a very rare genetic syndrome. David is the oldest person we know of and the only person with a fully inclusive life, actually, internationally. And so he has parents that have been very strong proponents of inclusion. He has significant health challenges, multiple disabilities. Again, no ordinary or regular means of communication. His health goes up and down, and he's had the opportunity to be fully included at in a college and works today. So we have professors and instructors modifying and adapting curriculum assignments and grading, and they're doing this voluntarily, by the way. This is not an obligation or requirement. They make the choices as to what they do in those classrooms. They're drawn into it. We have a video you'll see later today, I think, and another one that's almost finished, which will be newer. We've interviewed dozens and dozens of faculty. And almost literally every one of them, without prompting, will talk about how much more they gain from the experience of accommodating a student with intellectual disabilities or significant disabilities in their classroom than they thought they ever gave. So will their peers share that over and over again. Our continuing talk about, as we all do, that inclusion is about the benefit to students with disabilities is in fact incorrect. Because all of us stand to engage, and all of us stand to, if you want, benefit from for their inclusion. So they've traveled, they do practicums, they go on archaeological digs. They come with passionate interests sometimes. They remind the professors why they were there in the first instance, who have become jaded after teaching some of you for decades. Because they've had people like you in their classrooms, right? So it's kind of hard to maintain the interest. And there are supports on the campuses, but the support in almost all the classes, except for those that need personal care assistance, comes from their peers. Right? And so that's who their study groups, they do projects together, they get marked together. And then, of course, you get this moment in the life of a parent who never imagined this from early on. So just as maybe if you had that opportunity, your parents were proud of you if you were fortunate to have that experience. Imagine what it's like to have, this is, I forgot his name now, shoot. Can't remember his name. Anyway, he has somebody with autism and intellectual disabilities, and he is fascinated, others would describe it as obsessive and compulsive, by the air duct systems that are in here, right? So he would be telling you how they work and where are they and drawing them out for you, and he would persist at that. There's a heating and ventilation air conditioning program at our Northern Alberta Institute of Technology. It's perfect for him, actually. It's a relatively small program. I guess not a lot of people are fascinated by duct work. And so he was included in that and got a job then working in a company that produces that kind of ducts, if you want. But his professor, who's down here, the instructor who's down here in the corner, makes an effort to make sure all of his students get a job when they leave. Now, this is something, at least in Canada, important to universities and colleges. In many ways, they get looked at in terms of what are the outcomes for graduates. Because they want their students to go on to be successful, and they're competing with each other. And so he makes an effort to get everybody a job. And so he made an effort to get this young man, whose name still escapes me, a job. So students pay tuition like any other students. They participate in all the aspects of co-curricular life, just to use Leslie's term. Student government. We've had students elected to student council, for example. They've lived on campuses and residences, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Also true for people without disabilities, from my experience, actually. They participate in the communication systems, in the radio, in the student union. They graduate with their peers. They cross the stage. They leave with a portfolio. They've all had paid summer employment. We don't do any unpaid work, or work for less, in fact, than what the going wage is for people without disabilities. This is Murray. Murray was the first student to be included at the University of Calgary, so maybe 25, 26 years ago. Now, Murray has very significant multiple disabilities. He doesn't have any means of communication. He needs support to walk, etc. His brothers had gone, I think his brother, in fact, had gone to that same university. He was a very famous quarterback, etc. His parents wanted Murray to go to university. And so he had, again, and he still works today, actually, had an opportunity to be fully included in university and pursue his interests. This is Kyle, who seemed more interested in things that weren't about studying. Actually, I just put that up as a way, projecting, in a way, what campus life can look like in terms of what you're doing outside of class and study, because that's where you form relationships and friendships, right? That's what you remember. That's where you find out a little bit about who you are, if you want. And so, this is Michael. He just, in fact, now or today, actually, this is this year. So, for us, if you want, we're not quite sure why we're still debating this, because it's not actually about how to do it. We need to be clear about that, right? That's really not what our struggle is in K-12. It's not about how, right? It's about a culture of schooling, at least in North America, that's never been about inclusion for all from its inception. Whether we're talking about women, people with racial minorities, indigenous communities, etc. We began our schooling on the basis of the fact that it was only for some. And that culture, that hidden culture, keeps getting transmitted. We need to stop having teachers talk to themselves in lunchrooms. Have you ever been in a teacher lunchroom? If they're not in a school system where really there's a real commitment to inclusion, it's too easy to submit to the societal devaluation that Darcy talked about earlier. And so that's a challenge for us. So he's been included in sociology, post-colonial diasporic literature. How much time do we have? A minute? About? Okay.
1 minute.
So we have means of evaluating it. It's like popcorn. Okay. Now, as long as no one has a seizure as a result of this, we'll be okay. Let's see what else we have here. So what I want to describe to you.
Have access to this whole PowerPoint.
Yeah, you'll have it all. But part of the reason is with so many pictures, if you don't hear the stories, you don't know what's going on. This is Daniel, actually. Daniel runs his own business in a small community. He also gives the farm weather reports. Now, farmers live by weather, often. Okay, maybe not exclusively, but often, right? And so Daniel is fascinated by weather. He has a whole meteorological setup in his community. He goes in each morning and he reads the radio, the weather report. And yes, it's not fluid. It's not the smooth voice of a radio personality, if you want, etc. But in his community, it's a really critical and important voice. And of course, forming relationships and friendships. Think about how many close friends do you have necessarily? Usually a couple, one or two. Or you're like me and you're not sure. And so, but think about how many thousands of people you've met over time. Thousands that you've been engaged with to come up with a couple. And so when you see the limitations in the lives of people with intellectual and other disabilities, we don't have to wonder why is it there's so sometimes few social networks in their lives, because they haven't had the same opportunities that we've had in order to find the people who might understand us. And then of course we have a university that can't spell, it should be fine arts. This is a graduation ceremony, and then that experience. And I'll share more of that with you in other slides. So what I wanted to try to say is, while we're focused on how to include all kids in regular education, there are many places in our communities today, in fact, where we're including people with the most significant challenges, actually. I'll just tell you one more quickly. In places in life where people have yet still to imagine. And so the odds are, when I do this, that many of you have not imagined people with intellectual disabilities being your classmates in university and college, or what you could learn from that experience and the benefits you would derive from it. And so that makes us, in some ways, even in our advocacy, part of the problem, which needs to be altered in order to become a greater part of the solution. Craig, it just reminds me how we get challenged quickly. Darcy's giving me an evil eye. You can't see it. she's carefully positioned herself so she can look, welcoming to all of you. But Craig was another man in a very poor institutional life, etc. It actually took us years to move him out. So he was going to university while he still had to live in the institution. That dichotomy, I think, testifies to human resilience at the same time. Anyways, he has multiple disabilities, like others. He doesn't have a means of communication, never had an education, and he's blind, visually impaired. And we figured out that he likes university wrestling. See, we don't think that way. We see someone presented as I just described to you. He loved getting down on the floor. He loved wrestling. Guys loved wrestling with him, etc. He becomes part of the wrestling community. Now, I'm not a big fan of even university wrestling, let alone other wrestling that you see on TV. But for Craig, it made a world of difference in terms of how he could belong and who he could connect with. And so in many ways, we need to take a moment to sit back and challenge our own imaginations and see the limitations we've created, even in our advocacy, for people to have an inclusive life. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bruce. Now you know I'm going to say something. I need the mic.
So, how many of you took high school chemistry 100 years ago? How many of you remember the formula for converting grams to moles and moles to grams? You don't? Okay. What's the capital of Somalia? Because certainly you all know. What was the dynamic that was going on between Romeo and his father in the second act of Romeo and Juliet? Okay. So even though you didn't learn, at least you didn't retain, all that information, we still thought, or your teachers still thought, for some reason it was important for you to be in the room when that information was being taught. Right? But we somehow, we don't look at students with disabilities as falling under that rule. He doesn't have the prerequisite skills, is one I hear an awful lot of the time. He has an IQ of fill in the blank with whatever number. He's just too disabled. She'll be bored because it's over her head. He needs to learn life skills like how to cross the street safely 3 out of 5 times. Bruce, they get mine quicker than they got yours. Her developmental level is 1 month, 18 months, 3 months. She's low functioning. There's just nothing there. So from here on forward, we will challenge you to not ever use any of those phrases, to never talk about your own children's, quote, developmental level or IQ, because they have nothing to do with pretty much anything. So I'm one of those people that have been labeled or been accused of being an inclusionist. I'm an all means all person. And I think that part of this idea of all means all is that we need to presume every student's competence and ability to benefit from inclusive education. Every single solitary student. And back when I was first doing my work, I would say this is in the late 80s, I remember doing a presentation for a group of faculty on inclusive education, which was really in its infancy, at least in New Hampshire at that time. And I started showing slides of kids. And when I showed this slide, someone raised her hand and she said, I really believe in inclusion, but you don't really mean students with Down syndrome, do you? Right? A little later on in my career, when people in New Hampshire had already agreed with this idea that, yes, students with Down syndrome could be included, they said, but you don't really mean Leslie. Leslie is a student who, because of her particular disability label, gets in her classmates' personal space too closely. And if her classmate happens to be eating something, Leslie will grab it and eat it. So people said, not Leslie. This little girl, Miranda, has a disability called Angelman Syndrome. Again, some years later, people are like, okay, I get the kids with Down syndrome. I get the kids, who may have a medical issue, but we can figure that out. But you don't really mean kids with Angelman syndrome. They clearly are some of the most disabled kids in the world. Then people said, okay, I get that maybe all those kids with the strategies you've taught us, but not students like Marika. Marika doesn't walk, she doesn't talk, she needs assistance to move pretty much every part of her body. Then they even said, but you don't mean students like Charles, who uses his feet? Aren't the other kids going to be so grossed out by the fact that he does everything with his feet? He eats with his feet, he attaches the battery cables with his feet. You don't mean students like Stephanie, you don't mean students like Deshawn. So I think the point is that as long as we leave open the possibility that there are some students who we know cannot be included, then we're going to spend more of our time trying to figure out who those students are than we are going to spend our energies on figuring out how to support that other group of kids. And I think these kind of glass half empty assumptions about students' competence just lead to those debates going on and on and on about who should be included and who shouldn't. So to me, all means all is just going to save us a lot of time, a lot of lawyers' fees, and a lot of parents' years and years of kind of fighting the same battles over and over again.
Just a little bit about the research. One of the longest research longitudinal studies done by Baker, Wong, and Wahlberg. Special students in regular classes do better academically and socially than their comparable students in non-inclusive settings. And it's not new. 30 years of research is lined up to show that inclusion is good not just for students with disabilities, but for all students. And of course, my favorite is why it's good for schools is it's a civil rights issue. That's what we said we would do, is educate children. And that's probably the most important to me. Location, and general education is the prime real estate, at least in my mind.
I just want to show you some stories quickly. As somebody said it earlier, actually, because when you're a parent, in fact, this is about your child's life. So there you are sitting in a school meeting, you're talking about yes, no, negotiating resources, etc. For a principal, it may be about how am I going to do this, what will the teacher say, etc. For you, it's about your child's life as a parent. So you're not actually talking to each other at that moment in time. And so need both of you to get on the same page in terms of teachers then and principals talking about the fact the difference they're going to make in a child's life. So we know we can do inclusive education, actually, even though not everybody's doing it. But in fact, what would it take to move to something like this for large numbers of people systemically? So I'm just going to show you a couple of stories, but what you have to remember is I can easily multiply this by a few hundred, actually, just in where we live alone, so you get some idea of the impact. So we've already talked about that. I'll come back to this young person when we talk about the benefits to society. Okay, all right. Oh, we do? Okay. So maybe I should save this for tomorrow then. Might do that. In general, why? Well, I'll just show you this one then. I'll do this quickly instead of the others, okay? So this is how a young child was described to me. He's 7 years of age. He's been removed from his home at the age of 2 because of abuse and neglect, right? He's then put into foster care. He's in 7 different foster homes in 5 years. He has multiple labels: oppositional defiance order, one I'm proud to hold myself, reactive attachment disorder. He's very violent. He has health educations and health challenges. And up until that point in time, all of his education was segregated and congregated. And in fact, he was considered unadoptable, right? So there's, inches of files on him, etc., but nobody knows him over the period of 7 years. Where's he going? You said it earlier. What's his life going to look like by the time he's an adult, if he lives that long? Prison, on the streets, on drugs, etc., maybe worse than that. What's the cost to him and to society? Yeah, it's both whether you look at it financially, look at it in terms of a wasted life. This is in fact what you look like. It doesn't quite match, I don't think. You're pretty cute, actually. And so we have to be careful about what the cost to society is, because when we figured out inclusion to a greater degree, what's happened, at least in our country, may not be true in the States, is that we have seen more inclusion, but we've seen a massive growth in human service system, and it takes up a huge amount of money, and it has to grow every year in terms of costs. And the idea that you're going to have a good life, for example, on the basis of the fact we're going to find enough qualified staff to stay with you consistently with the knowledge to facilitate inclusion, is never going to happen, right? So it's not that people with disabilities should become a point of employment entry for people without disabilities, that we're going to have to engage the community to a much greater degree in wanting to have inclusion, to be when they have conversations and they're deciding, in fact, maybe there's some parents who run a soccer league somewhere, for example, for kids. Do you do that in the States? You play soccer a little? Right, okay, good, just checking. And so when they're sitting down to organize their soccer league, right, when thousands of kids play that, they're thinking about, are we making sure that everybody feels welcome? Have we taken into account children with disabilities? Have we organized the coaches and the secondary coaches, all to understand how to facilitate inclusion? Because if all we're doing is pushing kids in, and they're not in fact drawing kids in, we're not getting far enough, and society isn't quite getting it. So that's some of the work that we're trying to do. And of course, in 30 seconds, I'm not going to really tell you much about that. I'm going to skip. So this is what it means to benefit society. This is Nicole's own story and her slides. I'm just showing them quickly. She grows up and having an inclusive life. She's an Alberta girl, so you have to learn to hunt and kill, apparently. I don't know if and then she goes on junior high field trips and so on, so she has opportunities for friendships. Then she wanted to be in a marching band, or no, they call it a show band, actually. And I know you have those here as well, maybe even in Nebraska. And so this is a highly competitive band. And we have lots of kids now and young people being included in competitive sports, by the way, okay, which is something that you don't see, I think, often enough. So it's a competitive band. She wanted to be in it. She liked the uniform. We're not quite sure why she wanted to march, maybe it's the uniform. And she's at the front of the band, as you can see, and the band is going on an international competition to Italy, so everybody's really excited about it. There's a board meeting because there's a parent that wants to debate, should Nicole go, because she can't quite march in step, and if she goes, then they might not be as successful otherwise. And her mom went that evening to the board meeting, all prepared, all armed, had all her arguments, an emotional tightrope, et cetera, et cetera. And the other members of the board said that maybe this isn't the band for your daughter, actually. And they went, and actually they did win some medals. And then, of course, post-secondary. But it means being a community member, right? So it's not just inclusion in school. That's part of having a life. And so Nicole's been on the member of the library board in her community. It's a nonprofit organization for quite some time. She's been the secretary of the board. She needs help and support to do with those things. She's well known in her community. She participates in fundraising events for the library. And then she and her brother-in-law, which is, I think, how he endeared himself to his mother-in-law, actually, went into business together. So that's a good idea, right? If you're the son-in-law, actually, and you don't think your mother-in-law really appreciates you, do something with one of the daughters, like start up a business. And so they start up a business in their community. It's called Coffee News. I'm not sure you have that. It's where you place these little newspapers into local coffee shops, businesses, et cetera. You can read something while you're waiting for your food, et cetera. They were the most successful franchise in North America, actually, because Nicole's job is to go into businesses and convince people to have coffee news there. Now, Nicole doesn't talk a lot. She likes to say no more than any other word. But to be able to earn a living and do this, she has to be able to go in and have convince people to hire. I think she's convinced 700 businesses to have coffee news, actually. They're in multiple communities. They've bought and sold other franchises. She has somebody that takes her around, and now she's an active member of the Chamber of Commerce. So from a societal point of view, in fact, this all makes sense. Follow your dreams. This one we won't do. One more. Just wait a minute. Trust me. Enjoying that? Okay, what happened to him? You can't leave this sitting there, right? That's my son, my younger son. And it was really by chance that we were able to adopt him, actually. And here he is. This is a bit out of date because now it's 11 years with been employed as in a company that manufactures elevators. So I'm able to say to people, he makes a difference in your life. On those elevators that work, I'm sure he constructed them. On those that don't work, they came from another company. Right. He shows up. He doesn't show up for work. Work slows down. He's part of the assembly line. He's a shop hand. They need him. And he really fits in well because in that environment, personal hygiene is not an issue. Right. Now, he can't manage money properly. He can't look after himself properly. He can't manage his diet, etc., but he can be employed. Then he was asked to be the best man at his brother's wedding. Now, Todd was very violent, very aggressive, very dangerous to live with, not easy at all. It was a long time ago now. Actually, his violence was, in fact, life-threatening to us. So we had to figure out how to stay together as a family in that context. And then now it'll be 3 years this summer, he fell in love. They got together, and it takes two families to support them and got married. And so the point is, unexpected possibilities, right? And you cannot predict that from his earlier life. You have to change the course of his life entirely. Now, we all like to say that people with disabilities are often sort of limited by the lack of our imagination. Like a lot of you who are parents in the room, I like to think I have really high expectations. You can't surprise me, etc. And then you get surprised because now they babysit our grandchildren. So the fact that my older son, if you want, has the trust in my younger son to have him and his wife come over and babysit so they could go out is something I had not anticipated. And so the benefit to my son without disabilities is pretty significant as well. That's the benefit, if we want, to all of us.